So I think it's important to be cognizant of why there is a Columbus Day in the first place as a national holiday. And Columbus Day as a holiday is indicative of a particular American saga of trying to right our wrongs, a particular American struggle between what I feel are our collective sins and our collective virtues. So Columbus Day as a holiday was a response to the largest mass lynching in the history of the United States of America. And that was a mass lynching of Italians and Italian Americans in the state of Louisiana. And last year, the mayor of New Orleans, who is an African American woman, apologized to Italians and Italian Americans for that. So, grazie moltissimo, signora, per la scusa profondamente. Grazie moltissimo. So at the time of the lynching, we're talking the 1890s, a lot of Southern Italians and specifically Sicilians emigrated to the United States, the South, places like Louisiana, and they worked in the agrarian positions that were vacated by the relatively recently emancipated African American slaves. And the Italians, the Sicilians, by and large, were willing to work for wages that, understandably, African Americans were no longer willing to work for. You're talking about a time in which lynchings, be they against African Americans, be they against Italian Americans, they may even be published in the newspaper in advance that tomorrow there's going to be a lynching. Very difficult to hear that, I agree. But even newspapers like the New York Times would publish editorials describing in utterly vulgar and bigoted and racist terms exactly what the establishment felt about our inherent worth, we Italians, our inherent lack of worth in the newspaper, in terms, utterly vulgar, abhorrent terms that today would cause riots. There was a whole shitstorm diplomatically between Italy and the United States because of this lynching. And so the president was a major force in establishing as an amends a national holiday. And Columbus was a choice. Perhaps compromise would be the word, but it really was a fairly obvious choice, I think, when you figure that Columbus was the reason, whether you are an Anglo-American or whether you are a Latin American or whether you are an Asian American or whether you're a free African American. Columbus is perhaps the most immediate reason or the most immediately understandable reason why all of us are here. Today, we live in a society of much indignation. And often our indignation is right. If we have indignation towards injustice, towards ethnic injustice, racial injustice, but that also doesn't change the circumstances of why all of us are here for bad and good. And someone who I imagine would agree with me is Simón Bolívar, the great liberator of Latin America, who named his own country of an independent, i.e. imperialist-less country of pan-Latin Americanism, Colombia, after Columbus. In retrospect, we call it Gran Colombia to distinguish it from the present-day country of Colombia. But obviously, Bolivar, someone who came from a family, a Latin American family that was hand over fist wealthy because of their slaves in this land, and someone who, as a revolutionary, freed his slaves. So obviously he's someone who was cognizant of Spain being the originators and instigators of slavery in this country, but also the instigators of his own wonderful ethnicity existing. And Colombia was a term for a long time, whether it was North America or South America, for this entire hemisphere. You have America, you have Colombia, which were essentially the same thing. If you look at the country of Colombia, if you look at the Hollywood studio Colombia, Columbia Studios has a woman in a toga, sort of evoking this general, I don't want to say goddess image, but because in Latin and therefore Italian and Spanish, the land, terra, terra in Latin and Italian, tierra in Spanish is obviously feminine. So the land, whether it's America, named after Amerigo Vespucci, or Colombia, named after Cristoforo Colombo, takes on a feminine identity. And if Simón Bolívar was able to essentially walk and chew gum at the same time, and was a champion for freedom, for the abolition of slavery, for pushing out the imperialist, which in his case was Spain, and in the case of the United States of America was Britain, the fact remains, and Bolivar was cognizant of that all of us, whether you're talking about the good or the bad, are obviously here because of Columbus. I write film criticism for an Italian-American outlet, and I once got into genteel fisticuffs with another film critic as to whether or not Penelope Cruz should count as diversity at the Oscars for having won her Oscar. Penelope Cruz is from Spain. I don't mean to single her out. She's wonderful, obviously. She is of a people, of a country that committed genocide against the natives of the Western Hemisphere, of a people of a country who invented the transatlantic slave trade, which brought African slaves here. She's of a people and a country who created a caste system in this country that measured the inherent value of these human beings by their ethnicity. How much were they purely this or part that, which are the foundations of racism. That those are the people in the country that, I'm so sorry, Miss Cruz, she comes from. For some reason that I can't quite comprehend, because of the obvious fact she therefore is going to natively speak the same language as most of this hemisphere that had inflicted upon it the actions of her country, we see that as diversity. Because frankly, we're not really thinking, we're not really cognizant of our own history or putting two and two together. Christopher Columbus, Cristoforo Colombo, was the person who brought the people of Penelope Cruz's country here and was fairly quickly out of the picture, arrested in chains, because basically he was not providing for a profit off of the violation of this hemisphere fast enough for his Spanish employers. So how is it that today we lack the cognizance, like Simón Bolívar had, to acknowledge that someone like Christopher Columbus is the reason for this hemisphere as we know it today, which includes the good, for the entire ethnicity that Simón Bolívar identified with, as well as acknowledging the atrocities. But we won't look, we'll praise someone from that country today, Spain, as somehow being indicative of a celebration of diversity when she wins the Oscar, when she's of the people that felt Columbus wasn't even raping the place at a profitable enough clip. So if Penelope Cruz is indicative of diversity at the Oscars because she speaks the same language as people who were the victims of her country's colonial history, then likewise, Marion Cotillard also represents diversity at the Oscars, because there are millions and millions and millions of Black Africans who speak the same language as her because of her country, France, because of that country's history as a colonial power. So someone like Bolívar obviously was cognizant of the totality of that issue, and he certainly wouldn't consider someone from Spain winning the Oscar as indicative of diversity, but he obviously understood the totality of the issue that all of us in this hemisphere live by. And I think that what has happened in the century since is this washing of Columbus. Not a whitewashing because he was white, but being an Italian and therefore a Latin person, which he was, I would say he's sort of been Anglo-washed. And perhaps that's a reason also why in so much of Anglo-America, he's kind of become just vague enough as opposed to being specifically Italian. I mean, why not a Leonardo da Vinci Day or something like that? Not that he had much to do with this hemisphere, but I feel that Columbus is a vague enough concept that Anglo-normative people who might have, especially at the time, otherwise been racist and bigoted against Italians, would be down for. And I think that unfortunately also today, people who are not Anglo-normative or Anglo-normative people as well have Anglo-washed Columbus, who was an Italian Latin person. We are truly a universal country in that almost none of us are ethnically tied indigenously to this place. We all come from somewhere else. Every corner of this nation is the embodiment of a different history. We don't have a singular source culture. What binds us is the fact that for one reason or another, we all came here from somewhere else and were bound by things like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and a government of the people, for the people, by the people. And so it is a particularly American tragedy that we as a society, whatever color, whatever ethnicity you may be, do not truly champion each other and our inherent diversity. I feel that perhaps no other emigration story and history and immigrant experience has been as mythologized as that of the Italian American. I think you also would be very hard pressed to find another ethnicity in America that has been as culturally appropriated. This country, this hemisphere, America, is named after an Italian. Does anybody care? Whatever your color is. Our government was modeled after the ancient Roman Republic. The American forefathers consciously emulated the government of an Italian culture. Everyone eats pizza. Everyone has their grande macchiato or their 20 latte. Now, likewise, I don't believe that the Irish or the Polish or the Senegalese or the Kenyans or the Indonesians, or for all I know, the Chinese Americans are also properly and authentically represented and appreciated. I really don't think that American history has left much room for the truest and most authentic appreciation of those cultures either. But the name of this country is not an Irish one, or a Polish one, or a Senegalese, or a Kenyan, or an Indonesian one. The name of this country is Italian. And those other beautiful cultures that I just mentioned, they certainly aren't as commercially or in terms of consumption as exploited or consumed as much as Italian culture is. And I feel that to the extent that anybody cares about the Italian culture they are consuming, be it food, be it fashion, that they only care in so much as their consumerist desires make them cognizant that it is the culture of a real people who have a real history, and that goes for all segments of society. There obviously is a side of the political spectrum that is less than tolerant of immigrants, right? And what will they say? That this is America, right? Do they have any idea that they're referring to a specific ethnicity that was not indigenous to this hemisphere when they are beating their chests for America? There's another demographic that refers to their culture as ghetto. Ghetto is an Italian word. It means ghetto. I can't tell you how many people, when they heard that we named our dog Dante, thought that we were naming him something that was ghetto fabulous, when Dante is just about the most traditionally quintessential Italian name you could possibly choose. So we're not only perhaps the most appropriated culture, but all the people that appropriate us are the most apathetic to the fact that it's we they're appropriating. And I think that perhaps we're also the most caricatured of ethnic groups in the United States. And frankly, I can say it, I think often Italian Americans buy into self-caricature. To our credit, I think we also have perhaps done the best job out of all the diverse European immigrant groups here, certainly, of preserving our culture. You know, during the turn of the millennium, a lot of journalistic publications like newspapers, Time magazine, Newsweek magazine, would publish lists of the 100 most influential people of the past millennium. And by and large, there were 3 times the amount of Italians on that list than the next closest ethnicity. But we so often are reduced to caricature. And Columbus, probably was the most influential person on planet Earth of the last 500 years. If you are in this hemisphere, whatever flag of whatever country you proudly wave, that country would not exist without Columbus. But in terms of a federal holiday, something that at a national level, at a pan-American level, deserves acknowledgement by everybody in terms of its influence, its apropos nature to all American people. Obviously, Amerigo Vespucci would be the person, whether you are an Italian American, whether you are an African American, whether you are an Asian American, whether you are any other kind of European American, whether you are a Latin American. Obviously, you are referring to yourself specifically through a scope of an Italian man named Amerigo Vespucci. And unless all of us want to go back to Europe, or want to go back to Africa, or want to go back to Asia, we all have to come to terms that inherent within our self-identities as people of this hemisphere, unless you are the few remaining who are predominantly self-identify as the native and indigenous, we all have to come to terms and grips with the fact that we are all the fruit of a very complex and a very problematic history per our modern values. Do you, do I, do we have the courage to face those truths?